but also thinking about the architecture itself, having the seeds of supporting different kind of way of thinking about supporting life, right? If that's through some of the things that we've seen, like the growth house or other kinds of stuff, it's really about trying to hybridize and develop a form of technology that's very much about an architectural technology or concept of an architectural machine. So when we think about those things, we think about material in terms of process. Those would be additive or subtractive, or we think about it as something that's already prefigured and deployed with concepts of self-assembly, self-organization. So each of the teams will have to be able to articulate a concept of matter within this kind of either process-driven or deployments kind of driven scenarios. Now, I think in the context of that, the same can be said about environment. Since some of the concepts that we're looking at are more atmospheric or are really about potentially situating our work within much larger kind of landscapes, you know, we have a certain kind of relationship to scale and magnitude, which I think is very different from, let's say, the molecular to the scale of an ocean, for example. So when we are working with that kind of concept of the elemental, I think it's very important to also define what environment is for us. So environment obviously has potentially a very direct relationship with material, but it also has a very direct relationship to scenario, which is what is the architecture for? How do we evaluate its deployment? And what are prototypical kind of testing scenarios that these kinds of architectures could be implemented in? So the goal for this term, I think, is quite a lot. We've done a kind of more free-form experimentation, and we've done a pretty focused kind of way of approaching computation as a framework, but now it needs to be deployed in a way that starts to make it legible, how it is that we're creating space, how are we creating the conditions to support life, and where is this architecture really manifesting. So it's a given that our world is formational, it's durational, and it's obviously very time-based. The question is, what are the time frames? What do we mean by duration? How accelerated is that? So these are the basic kind of conditions that I want the Term 2 booklet, in some sense, to structure itself around, particularly with the research that you guys have done, and in some ways already just declaring in a certain way an intuition towards a materialization strategy. Does that stuff make sense to you guys? Are there questions about that? And we'll talk about it in depth with each of the teams, but I think the first and foremost, what I see in the document, which I have to say at some moment is kind of a very artificial way, is describing the computational stuff separate from the research. Like, this is a very artificial divide. I also think that some of the teams have given, I think, a very in-depth research on a whole series of historical precedents, architecturally, or through settlement, or through a response to a particular environment. Those things need to be somehow qualified into what opportunities those things actually give us, right? Because I think outside of that, then we have no way of really situating that. And I can give two examples. I think the water team has put together, I think, a pretty interesting research about settlements relative to scale of people, relative to the relationship to an environment. I think that is an interesting implication, and it also kind of suggests a future for the project that is much more about hosting, you know, varied kind of populations, but it also talks about a kind of urbanism that's part of its thinking of infrastructure. On the other hand, we have teams, for example, like the air team, that has really kind of given us a survey of a lot of projects that have been designed in engineering and architecture, and exploring different kinds of harvesting issues, if it's electricity or other things. That is an interesting also series of research, potentially, because that moves into the idea of a kind of operational infrastructure for energy production, for example, with these kind of tethered mobiles. So the reason that I'm stating that is that these things all have the possibilities of really influencing our project. And as we're kind of moving forward, those things have to be quite legible so that we understand what is the kind of history of research that's leading into your decisions. It can be the complete opposite, but it'll have to be argued as part of your thesis. Does that make sense? And I think that that's present in pretty much all of the projects. If it's from the Earth team, really showing a concept of landscape and terraforming, when I look at that particular project, it definitely seems to me that, you know, traditional distinctions between site and landscape and architecture would be completely blurred. It seems to me that the architecture would be a kind of embedded landscape. And so you see these kind of concepts and the larger kind of issues of terraforming and this kind of aspects being very much a part of the discourses around that kind of work. Does that make sense? So I think, like, when we're looking at the documents, you know, I think it's very important that we are really making that stuff very legible and not putting in things that just look very generic. On the other hand, we don't have much to look at in terms of documents today, and I think that's okay. We just wanted to see where you guys were. If I look at the fire team, which is the other team that gave a document, you have a particular slide which is really talking about, it says heat, light, energy, communication, and ritual. And I think that this slide is a really good way of structuring your book in terms of really trying to come to terms with what communication means for you. Ritual is an interesting aspect to think about the organization of space around social scenarios, not necessarily only between elemental as in terms of material, but also to think about the creation of space through basically the organization of human agency. There's, I think, the interests there where you guys have made subtext of cooking, bonfires, socialization. I think these are also very interesting because they suggest that architecture is not just about walls and openings. It's really also a choreography that's kind of enabled by this almost event-based way of thinking about architecture. So I think it's an interesting breakdown, but I think the book should be more organized around those themes to really give your definitions of what some of these things are. So for example, when we think about heat, or when we think about fire, or we think about sun, you know, the concept of illumination, I think, has many different ways of thinking about it. The concept of heat, those have very particular kind of, almost like thinking about architecture as an infrastructure of environmental control, which I think is a great thesis. And it connects, I think, to the whole concept of, you know, adaptive environments and thinking about what that relationship is as something that's evolving with the natural world. So I think it's a very potentially powerful thesis, but it has to be, you know, when we're looking at phototaxis, for example, or we're looking about seed dispersal and seed growth strategies, all of these things, they have to be somehow, you know, operationalized as, okay, this is an infrastructure that's trying to harness energy. How do we deploy that in an environment? And how do we use some of the analytical tools to be able to press some of those aspects, like surface area versus range of deployment, curvature, non-curvature, how these things are actually starting to think about concepts of spatial deployment, which could be more field-oriented. And these are the kinds of implications, I think, of some of the things that were there. So I think like all of the projects, I think potentially have a very strong thesis, but at the moment it seems like we have to do a lot of work to structure it in a format that also is helpful for you to see those opportunities. I think right now the studio is working in a very linear way, both computationally, in terms of practice, and for sure in terms of the way that the work was presented. You know, the work was not really a full onslaught of the different ways of thinking. And of course, we have to kind of edit out a lot of stuff. But I need you two guys to think that that stuff is also very important to help shape your brief and your project and your attitude towards architecture, okay? So we have a lot of work to do. At the same time, I think it's very exciting work because you guys are going to start to take decisions. And I think you will be understanding in a more intuitive way the possibilities of where some of this architecture can go. And particularly in term 3, we're going to be highly prototypical, meaning like we're really going to look at the elemental. When we talk about material, you know, if someone is looking at sand binding or these kind of things, or whatever it is, we're going to be looking at those subjects around those things. We're going to be looking at formations. We're going to be looking at strategies of making. We're going to look at what environment and climate control is. How do we harness energy? What's on-site materiality? It wouldn't really matter if it's in the Sahara or if it's in a beach in Corfu, or like, it doesn't matter. The point is that there are very particular environmental scenarios, and that somehow that would be very important to shape a kind of brief and a way of working that could say that this work can be deployed in a host of different conditions. So for the summer, we would be testing those applications in a scenario. But most likely we would be selecting 2 or 3 potential sites to deploy. And that would have potentially different populations that we would be looking towards to accommodate. And we would be looking at what that really means. I think we've also stumbled on, I think, some examples that are quite contemporary, like the water harvesting strategies, where you can really start to look at your architecture as a piece of technology. And I think that that's what we mean when we say about the elemental as technology. It's what can we somehow source from the material, the atmospheric, environmental properties to be able to really speak to a concept of sustaining life that doesn't always have to be dictated by mechanical systems of cooling and ventilating or generating. So these are the kind of objectives, and they're quite large ones. But I think as soon as we start to structure this now, I think that those things will become much clearer. Is there anything that I'm saying that you guys have any questions about? Sorry, I know we're still in holiday mode, so this is kind of like Theo's brute force, kind of like, okay, this is what we're doing. But realistically speaking, we've had a couple of meetings between Apo and Mustafa, also trying to get everybody on the same page to really see where potentially the work can go. And I guess the purpose of today's meeting is to really just have a short and focused conversation between all of you guys on your work. So this can kind of help kind of frame some of the stuff that you're doing with the book. So Apo, I think maybe it'll be helpful if you launch the guys' presentations, and maybe it's good for the students just to also kind of share maybe the thoughts that they have around the work as they're putting together the document.
Sure. Who is the brave one? Who is going to start?
I mean, we can start with, water is the document that is the most legible in terms of what it is at this stage. But we can go with any team, it doesn't matter to me.
Okay. Guys, do you want any particular one?
Let's go in order up.
Okay, I'll start with water from the end.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, you can share their document as well.
That's what I'm going to do.
The document is still a bit draft.
Yeah.
We're very aware that it's draft. I think the issue with the document, at least, I mean, there were only 2 documents, and I know that they're both very tentative for those that weren't there in the beginning of the conversation. I think we want it to be formatted like a phase 2 book, like B2, like you guys have done, B5, sorry. And it definitely has to be a resource document. So the framework of what we're talking about in terms of matter, technology, computational formation aspects, all of those things, I think it's important. So this format is correct in what we want to do. I just think that there are some artificial things about speaking about computation sometimes that needs to be expanded on a little bit more. But I think all of this, bringing this material and the diagramming processes and making it your own, I think is very important. So I don't really want to see too many generic things from a lot of the documents. So I think you guys have done a good job in terms of diagramming some of these things and making it kind of legible on your terms. And I think realistically speaking, when we're talking about computation or we're talking about material, like things like super cool temperature driven things or things that are really about cloud formations or all of these kind of things, I think these are all opportunities to define what we're talking about. So I think it's a good strategy. And I think that there are certain things that are very important, but I would like to have one explicit chapter on harvesting. So the concept of harvesting either through energy or through resource, meaning like harvesting can be a strategy of, let's say in this case, could be about collecting water, or in another case, like for fire, it can be about generating electricity through heat or sun exposure and stuff like this. I'd like to be able to fully declare a bias towards what it is that we're looking at. You know, some of these things have implications of desalination and things like this, if we're talking about water as a resource. So there's a lot of different issues, but I'd like us to be able to call out 1 or 2 of them in some detail. So I think these kind of settlement schemes and stuff like that, which is more urban, I think these are very interesting. And I think the fact that they support very different ecosystems and have different materiality and different concepts of food and other things that are byproducts of the relationship to the environment, I think we can learn from that. Mustafa, do you have something that you want to say to the guys around this work, especially around the computational work?
Yeah, I think the opportunity for this work next term is super clear and it's exciting. I think you guys did a good job on kind of setting up the basis of the framework. And I think what we should focus on next term now is to start to really push your computational work into the kind of steps of, first and foremost, clear and legible results and repeatable results, and then start to catalog and prototype those results. So to make that even clearer, Apo, if you go to the computational section of the document, I think what you achieved towards the end of the term was this, clarity of what a phase means computationally, and the mechanics you are using, we now need to start to kind of produce more legibility of the phases. So, for example, in the solid phase, I don't think our ambition is to just make it.
Go through everything. Just hold on to this slide.
Yeah, here is fine, Apple, if you want.
Yeah.
A lot of the results right now are basically just different states of the flocking system. I think we can now start to introduce rule sets that produce more coherent and repeatable results very quickly, for example, in the solid state, right? So when these things achieve a solid phase, what kind of relationships occur between the particles in a controllable manner, or between the agents in a controllable manner, so that we can start to produce legibility. And I think there's an opportunity there's two things after that, which is to start to think about the role of the other two phases, right? So if we agree that producing clear and legible, catalogable, prototypical patterns in the solid state is very possible, because it's easier to achieve those kind of structured results due to the low amount of energy in the population, we need to start thinking about what is the role of the liquid stage, what is the role of the gas stage, right? And, are we even going to use that terminology around it? But, we can think about that during the term. And one answer is to say that the liquid and gas stages are kind of reorganizational stages, that these stages exist to allow the system to configure, reconfigure, if you know what I mean, going from these highly structured solid state patterns to these kind of more free organizational patterns to allow for radical reconfigurability back into the solid stage. So that's definitely a question to be asked, or we should ask the similar but opposite question of, can we produce similar legibility in the other states as well? For example, is there a version of recognizable, clear, legible, structured pattern making in the liquid state, and maybe the gas state remains as the radical reconfiguration state? And then the next question is a question of scale, right? I think we've primarily explored the computation at a very particular scale. I think once you start to enter the realm of prototyping in computation, we need to start to radically rethink notions of scale, going from a place where, if you think about what we have now being the microscopic, what does the macro look like, right? So if you have 100 particles in your systems now, what do 100,000 particles look like? And, what are the opportunities for scale and pattern, right? At the micro scale, we get the ability to pattern out the rule sets, right? So when X amount of energy is present in a solid system, these kind of prototypical patterns tend to emerge. And that could be explorations of things like clustering, that could be exploration of things like fractal-like aggregations, it could be explorations of density, for example. And what happens when you take that system and scale it up 100 times or 1,000 times, and what has to happen in the input states of these systems to produce legibility computationally, right? So I think from my end, computationally, it's quite clear. It ties into what Theo was saying as a general headline for the term, which is, prototypical alignment across the work. And I think you guys are in a good place, like the majority of the teams, to do that quite quickly into the term. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if you guys have any questions about that, but it should give you an idea of, how we start to do this. Things like going into 3D and stuff like that is a given for me, but it's more about the attitude we take to the work in terms of legible prototyping at scale, and thinking about the nature of the role of these phases, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just want to kind of say a couple of things to that. I think the history of the studio relative to scale is to look at systems that can be applied at multiple scales. So even if the fact that you guys have been speaking about this on a micro scale, I mean, these kind of behavioral processes, at least in the way that you guys are writing rules, are consistent on the local and the global. What's not consistent is its legibility in terms of pattern or its translation in terms of one phase into another. When I also look at the stuff that you guys are doing, I think it's very clear that we have 3 particular phase change states, but we have really very little articulation of what that actually is. So we have very generic ideas. So for example, solid state is basically a packed system, and you're dealing with a gradation, but it has no inherent form, because actually it's basically already outlined as a solid element in a very generic way. So some of the research that you guys have implanted a bit of heat, gradation in something, basically showing how something would slowly change from one state to another. If I take some of the diagrams literally and say, well, how would we translate that? It seems almost like a default that it would be a solid piece of ice, and actually this would be a subtractive strategy. That could be one way of looking at it, but it shouldn't be the only way of looking at it at all. So the point is, we need to be able to articulate some possibilities, particularly computationally, to see how these things start to manifest themselves as not only constructs, but systems that you're trying to control. Now, control can be explicit, for example, printing, or it can be completely inexact and behavioral. I mean, the suggestion that in some sense is implied by some of the diagramming, some of the research, and some of the stuff that Mustafa just said, in the most radical form, I would move material as vapor and using air as an infrastructure. You know, like if I could play God for a second, I would control the clouds, I would control where it's raining, and I would manifest that into form as a kind of architecture. My infrastructure would be utilizing all 3 phases. To get to that point, I think we have to understand what each phase by itself is kind of offering. So it wouldn't be, oh, by the way, in this phase, we're just additive. In this phase, it's deployment. In this phase, you know, it would be something very different. These are the opportunities in each of the phases so that we can basically look at a kind of hybrid approach in terms of thinking about the research. So as you guys are developing these kind of prototypical manifestations computationally, the relationship of resolution is important because resolution is basically our tool for control. Pattern is what makes it legible to us. But in some ways, I think like the radicality of the project is going to be really in your capacity to introduce a form of control in these different phase changes. So that's where I think in some of our previous conversations, ideas of snowflake generation, why I find that interesting, or at least this was the example I gave the guys, was, okay, at the local level, we have finite snowflake generations that are pretty discrete. Within a certain population, you know, you can have a snowball, right? Or some whatever form you want from that stuff. But at a different scale, it becomes something like an avalanche, or it becomes a field or a landscape. Inherently, those structures are there, but the way that they behave is very much conditioned as a gradient towards environment or towards its discretion of an individual kind of thing. If it's an ice formation or solid state, it's more crystalline as a structure. If it's vapor, obviously it's a complete opposite. I think the best way to deal with these things is to deal with the extremes. And I think your computational framework has tried in some ways to think about the difference between a pact and a radical agent strategy that's completely free agent. And it's really about you guys trying to develop a computational framework that can move from one to the other. Its translation into material, or what is architecture, that's going to need a lot of invention. So that's why I think your concepts, no matter how radical, should be conditioned in that way, you know. So I think we can really start to think about scale in a very different point of view. Like, for example, if we're really thinking that the cloud is our infrastructure to move water, that would be pretty cool. You know, that's a pretty big picture kind of thing. But it would talk about a scale of atmosphere, which is very different than the normal scales of a part to whole relationship of what architecture can be broken down in. The same thing as if it's an ocean, that was the environment for a settlement. That is also a symbiotic relationship to things. So whatever the kind of attention that you guys will go into, if it's an extreme environment that biases, let's say, ice formation, and a kind of cold environment, it'll have a certain legibility for the architecture. Or it can be in the complete opposite as some of your settlement schemes. That will kind of get a better sense as you guys are working on computationally, and we see what kind of project you guys want to do. But I would outline each of these phases in a very discrete prototypical nature. See what are the opportunities, show me how you manifest 3D and 4D space. Okay.
Yeah. We
Okay.
have also put together some stuff that we try to develop, like more fragmentary developments through this break. We could also share this stuff if you want, because we didn't put that in the booklet.
Yeah, I think you guys you should start to organize that material within the framework that we're talking about. And I think you should send it through in the booklet. If it's animations and things like that, I mean, you can share it now too. I don't have a problem. But in the concept of time, just to be able to kind of go through everybody at the same level, I think maybe it's better that we just kind of talk through basically what we've seen up till now. And then we can set up another conversation next week to see the progress of where you guys have explored things, if you have. Okay. But I think the important part is just to really try to understand the concept of harvesting, where energy relies, how we deploy energy-based systems. And when we're talking about prototype, we need to be able to evaluate these things. So to go from something that's completely generic into something that's responding to an environment, like with some of the super cool research and all of that other stuff, is giving us certain kinds of formations that couldn't be done in a different way. And that could be as simple as starting with a certain volume in a sphere or in a cube or in a primitive, and introducing growth factor of an environment as you're adding material, you would start to see the formational differences. So we need to find techniques that make it legible for us.
We tried to see how we could introduce data from the environment or from the geometry, from humans, to affect a generative pattern, a generative formation. And yeah, we moved towards using our model. We tried to interpret this model that we already have with the bonds as a gradient material that actually can adapt a gradient of properties.
Sure.
So it's not like only an extraction logic.
It's true. I think the things that you guys have to also keep in mind, though, is that the gradient is a nice approach, but it also somehow is a unified approach. So that works really well when you think about an environment. But for example, when I look at some of your heat spots in your field that you've done in some of your gradient studies, that is basically where also you guys are introducing a concept of control, right? So our formations are not just going to be like instantaneous natures, where they're new natures, right? You guys are going to be exploiting some of these phase change characteristics, but also controlling how they get reformed. So, I mean, the material does what it does. A lot of it is driven really simply by temperature. But the use cases and how you exploit that and how that becomes a siphon for thinking about architecture in a radically different way means that you have to really be clear about a definition of control and really exploiting phase change. And usually it's almost going against to what the environment is doing, right? If you're in a very hot environment, you want to introduce cooling. If you're in a cold environment, you want to introduce a kind of heating source, to capture heat and retain it. Even this concept of heat transfer that you guys have been looking at, the way that you would deploy that is very much also in terms of the mass of the material. So even if you did a qualitative aspect of kind of sphere, let's say, that is a certain volume that's ice, and you said you introduce a heat value to it, or different heat sources, you would be accelerating a kind of melting in particular areas. If you were doing a super cool strategy, you would be adding, the same placements would actually be introducing a growth logic of icicles in an inverted growth logic, right? Why is that important? Because both of them are technically part of your material system. And you may not have to choose one or the other, but you may need to exploit one more than another at a particular moment in time. So it's really about trying to demonstrate that, trying to demonstrate it in an explicit way, the difference between a surface or a volume system that is maybe more primitive to something that is maybe more found in the environments that you guys are working on. So definitely it's not going to be land of platonic objects, but the way that you introduce material, the way that you transport material can be more like that. It depends. I'm not sure that we're making igloos in blocks, but we may be exploring materials in very different ways. So I think the overall point is to look at the computation between those three phase states and to really see this more than just particles that are, basically demonstrating a simulation of something that we know. We want to be able to control it and to kind of almost freeze it in a way as a moment in time that we can exhibit certain properties. That's much more legible in the solid state. But I think the atmosphere area, is the one that would probably be the most radical, because I agree with Mustafa that seems to me where the concept of infrastructure would be the most powerful to utilize air as a carrier of water and material.
Well, from my side, before you get too exposed to ideas and get confused, I'll try to keep it as simple as possible in one couple of sentences. But I think it's what we see, and we are a bit not concerned, but kind of trying to direct your project towards is kind of understand, and that's what I want to see actually, and want to work with you on that. Understand what is actually the use of water on your projects, and whether water is material, or whether water is technology, as you say, or is a metamaterial where you actually use the phase changing properties to create something new. Or whether it's actually an environment only, right? And you actually build basically your architecture is not actually water, but it could be on the water. Or if it's just energy harvesting mechanism or infrastructure, like we may capture water, we may convert water to something else, or we may use water movement for energy production. So there's a lot of topics there. And you don't need to focus in one necessarily. You need to do this kind of parallel working, not a linear sequence. We finish something, we start something else, and then we get the project, right? It's multiple trajectories, because we don't know which one of all is going to work effectively. So we need to kind of, let's say, jump through different strands of research and kind of get the best elements and combine them. So I think this is one of the topics I would like to see and work with you, is about the use of water and what this actually is. Are we on water? Are we with water? What is our architecture on that? And the second one, it would be your input variables, right? Because we talk about temperature, we talk about in other projects, heat or whatever it is. We need to justify and understand what is actually the input. What can we get from the environment that we can creatively work around it and use it to develop an architecture or an infrastructure or whatever is what we are developing. So it's something you actually need to focus quite hard on, because at the moment it's very much early days. And the last one would be more about data processing and what do you do with these inputs, right? How do you convert them to something meaningful? And what is the generative aspect of things? Is it just pattern making that means nothing, or how do we get data and we actually utilize them instead of just using them as pure numbers? We can produce numbers randomly, it's easy, but how do we evaluate data and we use them for our benefit? Well, that's kind of it.
Okay, should we move on to the next thing?
Yep.
I mean, if they don't have any questions, sure.
No, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Well, having no questions though, it's a bit weird because it's not the most straightforward stuff we are talking. So don't be afraid.
We have.
No questions means you are not paying attention. So
no, we do have questions, but we're being mindful with time. But
well, time is a secondary thing at the moment. I mean, I have a lot of questions, to be honest. I'm wondering how you don't have. But
no, we do have. That's why we have started already touching some aspects that we're discussing.
Okay.
So yes, but we did not have an answer, of course, to all these questions yet. But we started trying to find a way to handle with different data. What would that mean in terms of computation?
The thing is, Daphne, and for the team in general, I think the questions are always going to be there, and this kind of work is never short of asking further questions. The issue is about how we take decisions, and the best way to do that is to be much more experimental, to prototypically see what opportunities are. That's why I think each of the phases should be really exploited to see what opportunities are there. That will not be scale dependent, but you will deal with populations that will manifest themselves in different opportunities. Apo's point, if your project is situated in water or is exploiting water, I mean, at the heart of it, from a big picture strategy, I think that's a very important part. But for example, water as a resource is the thing that sustains life. Computationally, if it's like crystallization because you're desalinating water, or if it's because you're using ice, you can apply that in different strategies. Obviously, it'll be behaviorally a little bit different, but the principles will be inherently similar. So you will be working towards all of those things. The thing is, how much can you actually really work on? And how can you use the different frameworks and computational techniques to translate that information? So we have to invent sometimes some new techniques. How a gradation map kind of manifests itself in a form, well, that form is a moment of time. So then that becomes the information set that you'll run on top of. So even those things are not very straightforward, and that's why you guys will have to take some decisions, but that's going to happen from what you can demonstrate. So just feel determined to try to make those meaningful translations, even of just information, as things become more formational or things become more form-based, and see how that carries over as something that's time-based. So we will have to invent certain things, and we will have to exploit certain known techniques. And Mustafa and Alex will help you with that, and Apo will help as well with thinking about that information translation strategy. And we'll figure out what's the appropriate thing. Okay. Air team.
Thank you.
So you haven't sent us a booklet yet. We hope you start working on it, right? It's just not ready. So we should be expecting it soon. But just flicking through your initial research here. I think you have some very amazing, I would say, examples. I mean, some of them very much well known, some of them a little bit less, for instance. But for me, at least, the one kind of quite pulled my attention was where is it? This little guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I love vehicles. I like anything that flies or is on land or goes fast and stuff like that. But this particular is actually quite an interesting one, and the use of inflatables, the power of wind and air to generate, energy effectively, and designing and planning for a better future or a different future beyond just what we conventionally see around us. I think it's actually something quite interesting. And then, of course, all these kind of, technically very experimental ways to power and, travel and even stay in the air. I think it's very interesting concepts. So I think, between us, what we discussed is actually it's a good trajectory to start following, without kind of, you did some initial geometrical research on inflatables, but it needs to be much more rigorous and step by step to really start, trying to pose a problem and try to resolve it rather than just shooting in the air in random directions to effectively try to get something but you don't know what it is. So you need to define a little bit more what you actually try to achieve on that. And then computation, I think Mustafa could discuss more about what actually is the topic you could be exploring.
Yeah, I think the thing is, like, this project is moving in a direction that's very different from, let's say, the previous one. If the previous one is speaking to phenomenon, that's primarily biasing phase changing. I see this project and the conversations that we had really considering architecture as an infrastructure, where the concept of harnessing is really about thinking about the different kinds of accelerated flows and how that can be utilized. And thinking, of all of the presentations, this one was always kind of the most case study oriented. So on the one hand, techniques of inflation and patterning, and on the other hand, ideas of like, okay, here is a history of inflatables, here is the history of like active inflation or passive inflation in terms of like, a stadium roof that's using passive techniques of air as almost like a scaffolding to keep the structure suspended. So there were always some very different elements. I think the things that we found most compelling in the history of these kind of strategies were the ones that were generating energy and the ones that were also creating space, not in a traditional inflation strategy. So I think when we look at some of these elements, like some of these more deployable ones, like this Gram-Shane one, which this now piece is actually starting to create heat distinctions to be able to capture water. These things became more powerful to us because in some sense, it's not like the 60s and 70s where we just use air to generate space by using a very inflatable plastic bag strategy. What we want to do is a highly tailored architecture that in some sense allows us to deploy things. But I think the basic premise is that if our architecture can be considered infrastructural, then our architecture has a capacity to be deployed in many different areas, right? So the Gram-Shane example is in the desert. Some of these other examples, of inflation, in this kind of engineering, Army Corps of Engineers strategy for creating stability in an unstable environment. think all of these things are kind of interesting. The tethering system, though, and using not the ground condition, but really using the atmosphere as a strategy to harness energy, if we can really do that at very different scales, you can imagine an architecture that can be powered with this kind of tethered infrastructure anywhere in the world. We can convert that electricity into anything, right? If it's a much more mechanical project, like let's say the previous one. But in some ways it sets up, I think, a very interesting conversation. For example, here, heat is also lift. Is your architecture something that's grounded? Is it something that's like an air city, like Buckminster Fuller was talking about, where he's just talking about the difference of heat creating rise? You know, and people like Thomas Saraceno have been talking about these kind of things as well. So I think what's important about the project is you can consider some of these tethered relationships as an extension or like the battery pack to a architecture that, let's say, is maybe more traditional and on the ground. But you could also think about this architecture then lifting off and going somewhere else and really being nomadic in a sense. Because in some ways, the things that usually ground architecture in a finite infrastructure is usually street access or lack of mobility, right, to come to the architecture, and electricity. So in this sense, for example, we could be thinking that this architecture could be actually completely mobile, but it's not mobile because it has wheels. It's mobile because it consolidates its infrastructures as part of the architecture itself. And if we can generate electricity, we can use very much almost all of the kind of modern, let's say, comforts that we have in society to be able to deploy that. So that's why our conversations were looking a lot at these examples of the tethering ones, which are very different than slide 80, right? The wind turbine. The wind turbine is a fixed infrastructure. You know, it reinforces a place. The ones that are tethered, these kind of kite agents, also computationally, become super interesting because the way that they are tethered and the way that they fly and the difference between one and if you had thousands of these things together, it would make a very different kind of thought about what our infrastructure is, how energy is. This isn't something that's always in the air. It would have to have very different cycles that are responding to the weather. So I think that there is an opportunity there to think about some of that stuff. When it comes to the inflation work, I think the work right now is very generic, I have to say. And the ones that I think are more interesting is the ones that you're controlling inflation of a segmented linear body or something like that, because in some sense, those are like slide 19, for example. Slide 19, slide 20, those ones are basically quite non-directional organizations, right? But they introduce curvature because of inflation. So you're introducing a way to control something for something. When I look at something like slide 24, what I find a little bit difficult is here we have a much more complex pattern, but we introduce a lot of point conditions, which are very bad for flow. So with your inflation strategies, one of the things that needs to happen is, where is the inflation coming from? Those are the points that are being inflated. How does that move through the system, right? Because it's a circulatory system. And so I think like some of these geometries will need to be really articulated with some of that logic. And I think we should try to move away from this being a surface, like what you saw in the previous team, that they just kind of inflated, like these surfaces from the air team last year. That one was not very believable, right? Because in a sense, it was like an inversion catenary strategy. So I would like you guys to think about this much more like lattices. Even if it's more surface oriented, it's a thick surface. It's not just a pillow. So that you can control this in a much more complex way. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Do you understand why I'm speaking about these ones so much? Because it's using an inflation technique like you saw in the air team before, but it's not showing it in a strategy where, okay, if I have this flat piece of material and I'm inflating, how does this thing pop up? It wouldn't just be an inversion catenary, right? So I would like you guys to really look at how these things are flowing and how you can use pattern to really think about these things as bodies with circulatory systems. And in the strategy of inflation, you have valves that are one-way valves or two-way valves. That's controlling the passage of air. So you're generating basically the infrastructure for the airflow within your inflations. And I think that that's important to kind of simulate. But for the computational logics of the agent-based work and things like that, I mean, Mustafa can speak more directly to it, but I think using it as an infrastructure for harnessing energy and choreographing these elements, I think is something that you should look at quite directly, I think.
Yeah, I think it's, next term is a good opportunity for us to start to move these two bodies of work together. On the inflation side, I think Apo and Theo spoke about it quite clearly, about how we continue to prototype these kind of inflation-based body plans that you guys made a really good start on last term. I think, we can make it clearer why certain typologies of body plan are good and others are not so good. I think on terms of the kind of flow field work that, Gauja did towards the end of the term, what we can start to use that is more of a kind of environmental playpen for energy generation, right? As the basic principle of that model, right? So how do we use that environment that we have set up there computationally to start to test different agent principles? And the testing framework is this concept of energy generation, right? So we'll probably be looking at principles of turbulence, principles of flow, because that is generally how you extract energy from these kind of systems, right? By the introduction of principles like turbulence. The more turbulence you have, the more opportunity for energy generation you have, et cetera, et cetera. These kind of assumptions are things we can work on in your computational model, with the idea that some of these agents are representatives of these inflation prototypes, right? So we will have certain inflation bodies that harvest energy in a certain way when they are deployed in an air-based environment. And then we have this computational playpen or ecosystem or environment that we have, that Gauja set up towards the end of the term, in which we can start to test those principles at another level of scale, right? So the advantage we have there is we have both the ability to design the agent in the ecosystem, and honestly, we have the opportunity to design the ecosystem itself, right? We can design the airflows to test different opportunities, and we can design how the agents respond to that vector-based environment. And what we have to set up quite quickly in the term is this kind of energy framework, right? Where does energy exist in this system? How is energy measured and recorded in this system? So that we have a kind of evaluative framework to the outcomes of these results, right? So if you generate a more aggregation pattern of your agents, is a certain aggregation better? Most likely these are dynamic aggregations. Are those results more suitable for energy harvesting than others? Similar to this idea of like a kite-based thing versus a land-based harvesting device. There'll be ideas of how do we organize these things to maximize their energy potential. So basically, it will be a development of these body plans and using the kind of Maya-based environment to start evaluating them for how they deploy, how they can, I think essentially it's going to be how they adhere to a flow field or create turbulence to that flow field to allow us to understand principles of energy generation. And then on the vector-based work or the agent-based work, we'll start to look at this idea of, okay, how do we generate energy in this model? That is something we should answer quite quickly. And then how do we start to evaluate these agent-based deployments, aggregations, and organizations within this vector-based environment with the purpose of energy generation as the ultimate goal of these aggregations at the moment. So I think we have an opportunity to make the research quite clear and the two bodies of computational work quite relatable next term.
Yeah, I think it's also, I mean, the project in some sense can be quite simple, but its complexity would become quite clear very quickly. So for example, even some of that wind turbine research that you have, how much energy is generated? How long does it take to generate the energy? How many of those wind turbines would you need to power a house? You know, you can imagine it almost like a battery, you know, for some of these kind of electrical grid strategies that they have for offsetting electrical cars and electrical houses being powered by the same system. It becomes interesting to think about how discrete are these elements too. Even if I look at this diagram now that's on the screen, you have an inflatable prototype. How does it work as a collective? How does it share resources, for example, right? So the individual versus the collective, something that can be totally patterned as a prototype. How does it interact with other patterns? You know, is it always singular agents that are on their own and just deal with choreography? Or do they self-assemble into something that's larger and maybe driven with a different kind of purpose? So I think about, like, if we took a concept of the farm, your concept of the energy farm would be these kind of discrete deployable agents, and how they relate back to what they're powering would speak a lot closer to the relationship between your infrastructure and architecture. You know, you can imagine it like one house to one balloon kind of strategy, or you could think about it as a, you know, almost like these kind of 60s projects that thought about an instantaneous city, like this carpet of a city would float into an environment, drop down, and then potentially could lift off and be deployed somewhere else. So these are the kinds of things that we can talk about. But I think it's very important that we somehow build that into the way that we're working on the project. I also think, like Mustafa, a project like Cloud 10 would be a good resource for them to look at. And I do think that we can start to also potentially make some small scale models, even if it's in the home environment, of some of these airfoils, just using an iron and a little bit of cloth. You can basically start to design some of these patterns so that you can start to see energy as a product of not only harvesting, but how much energy is being utilized by the system. I think that sets up a good model for a real-time evaluation and the metric for it. Do you guys have any questions on what was being discussed?
Yeah, actually we have some question because in my opinion, I think we didn't have enough computational design part, so we have tried to do something about simulations of cloud in this holiday, and we did something. Maybe we can show this next week. But after this discuss, I think the computational design about cloud maybe not similar.
I think I don't think you need to worry about that. I think the concept of the cloud is a very interesting way of thinking about formation. I think it's very powerful because it's really using a really 4D landscape, right? It's not like the ground, which is primarily more stable. You know, the atmosphere is a 4D environment. So I think don't dismiss the simulations that you've done in the clouds. I think that any one of these points in these agents can be patterned at a different detail to be very, like some of the stuff we've seen in 24 or something like that. That can be how you pattern a surface of an agent. We can exploit that in many different ways. But clouds, I think, are definitely the organizational strategy that we should use. Otherwise, we would be replicating literally what Edison was doing with the box kites or something like that, right? A structure that's just kind of floating in space. It's cool, but it's not really generating the conditions that we're talking about, which is about harvesting energy. But if you imagine, what Apo said about taking that wind turbine element, it has to float in a 4D environment, and the cloud formation could be a strategy of how that formation of all of those different wind turbines organize themselves. So it's not just flying 100 discrete kites. You may be organizing themselves as a kind of superorganism to be able to address wind flow or to be able to maximize energy harnessing. So I think it's great that you guys have been working on the cloud simulations. I look forward to seeing that, and it should be part of your book. But see it as not something that you have to choose one. Just see what opportunities are different from it. Do you understand what that means, Yuan?
Yeah.
Is there any other questions, guys? In some way, I think the project is quite clear, but there are some it's not clear from one perspective. You have to take some decisions. But on another perspective, in terms of working on it, I think the methodology is clear. Pattern studies to help control and shape flow of air. Some of it is internal in terms of the things that you're designing. Some are responsive to the environment in terms of the flows that it's navigating through. And I think when we go to think about where the architecture is, I think just like the previous team, we'll take a position. How radical do we want to make it? And how legible is that for a real case scenario? So we'll have those conversations as you guys are putting this together. I think it's very important that you put this document together, though. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else from your team need to say anything?
No.
Are you sure? Okay. I think it's clear what architecture as an infrastructure is in your case. I think it's also clear what an energy harvesting is in your case. In terms of making that more legible, I think it has to speak to how much. So it gives us an understanding of how many. What's the duration of flight? What are these things doing when they're not flying? It's in that world. But I like the fact that it can be nomadic in some way. Okay. If there isn't any other questions, then we can move on. You guys sure there's no other questions? I'm going to ask one last time.
I think that's a yes.
I have one question. I think if we choose the same how to harvesting the energy, maybe the topic is a little bit of more about technology and we can't make the system build some roles in Unity, and I think that's maybe a problem in the next term. So I don't know how to. I just think it's more about the technology of harvesting the wind energy or the energy from sunlight. So I'm not quite sure if we can finally make can achieve that.
I think the things that you should think about, it's not so much that you guys are depending on existing technologies. It's really about you guys looking at some of these things, like the wind turbine that's tethered. You know, the one with that's really about wind. That's different from a wind turbine, which is really like the stick and the fan on it. I mean, I think even that as a concept is interesting enough to then start to think about, okay, how much energy is powered by that? And I know these systems are hybrid, so they use some solar energy to fly and to guide some of the stuff, and it's a hybrid system. But I think the thing that we want to explore is how can we utilize wind for mobility? How can we utilize wind for energy harvesting? Where will this architecture be deployed in? Well, if it's generating electricity, a lot of the modern ideas of living can be maintained in a more traditional sense of what we know in the contemporary. But what are the scenarios? If we have like 100 people living together, like a settlement, how would we distribute the wind turbines? You know, we are not constrained by land. And that's what is also quite beautiful, that these things could be floating. Just like you see like the festivals of releasing all of the balloons, right, with light in it, you know, it can be something quite magical. So how do we move it from something that's just mechanical and engineering into something that's really about creating a kind of cultural element around what we're doing?
Yeah.
You know, instead of having a big power plant to bring energy to a small village, how can we really start to think about something that is really like a hybrid? The architecture is both infrastructure. The architecture potentially could also move, not connected to the land in a very foundation, like concrete way, but actually something like the balloon, tethered. It's lightly on the ground and then it can move somewhere else. I think it could be very interesting.
Yeah, okay.
And for the unity problem, oh, you're going to try and it's going to be fun. And I promise you we'll do a good project. The point is to not get too stuck on one technicality. Let's try to imagine what this architecture can do. Just have a very kind of clear idea, because there are a lot of reasons why an architecture can be more mobile. And there's not a lot of architecture that generates its own energy. So even on that level, I think it would be a huge innovation if we can think about a way to power a small building, for example, a small cabin, small home with this kind of system. I think it would be really powerful. So I think you have good instincts. It's very clear, the research that you've done in terms of the history of all of these different flying machines and all of this stuff. So that's the strength of your project. And I think the simulations have to work in a couple of different ways. Some really about controlling air through inflation. So we need the things to be much more specific to be able to control flow through the system that you're designing. Some of it could be inflating to create space. Some of it can be inflation to be able to control how something flies. So we will need to look at inflation, not just like inflating a pod or just inflating a room. That's where the behavior is. That's where the control strategies are. So inflation, deflation would help think about how these things are responding to an environment. Okay?
Okay.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
No worries. No worries. Okay, is that it for this team? All right, let's go to fire next.
Yes. Fire. Wait, because we have a document here.
We have a document, yes.
Well, the booklet is really a draft. I think we just put everything we had inside so far to see what to sort of start organizing things. But we've mostly worked so far outside of the booklet. We prepared a PowerPoint for today, but I don't know if we have time or we should just like incorporate everything we have in the booklet and then take a look at it.
I mean, Panayota, it's up to you how you want to do it. I mean, we've had, I think, some pretty long-standing conversations about your project. So
no, just to give you like a very
of course
general idea, we started like after the review and all the comments we looked a bit at fire as a material and a metamaterial maybe. So we don't have this unfortunately documented right now in the booklet, but we tried to take that direction also because we did a lot of computational work on different materials. So the research was lacking on that part. So we also tried to explore that.
I can say maybe, Apo, if you leave that that first slide that you had, the one that we've been talking through. I mean, I think, Panayota, for you and your team, your project is an interesting one because it's highly debated between the three of us in some way, in terms of the ways that one can approach it. So I think what's important, at least from my perspective, is that this particular slide for me somehow really speaks to an interesting way to frame your book and also an interesting way to frame the possibilities of what the project is. I think it's the clearest from all of the things that you guys have done, because in some sense you've made it your own in a way where, you know, if it wouldn't be so clear to me what ritual would mean as a word in the context, but when you introduce it as an idea of cooking, socializing, you know, warmth, you know, it opens up a very different kind of context, right? When we talk about energy, beyond heat and those kind of things, you know, you spoke about infrared radiation, electricity, and even that photograph of the Moses project using the infrared cameras to look at for migrants, and even a system to actually really see the human body as also something elemental, as a form of heat. I think that there are certain things that are implied. So I think what I think is very important is, like, you have, I think, 2 or 3 potentially very generative strands. You know, we talked about the Philip Rahm stuff and everything, but these are usually very like simulation oriented, and they have difficulty being translated in the real world, right? But they give us techniques, which I think are important to look at. But the things that for me were interesting was, you know, the reconfiguration due to phototactic reasoning, you know, like sunflowers reorienting themselves. You know, when I look at this, it already says something like, okay, here's a deployed field strategy. Each of them are individual, but they are highly choreographed to respond to, for example, in this case, the sun. You have the body as temperature, like within these kind of infrared cameras. There were just a lot of different things that I think potentially can be very rich. I think the things was to think maybe primarily from my side beyond heat. So I think computationally, you guys have been looking at a lot of heat transfer, and I think that that's an important thing, but we haven't really spoken too much about, well, beyond the simulation of it itself, what opportunities is it doing? So in some sense, you're working very closely to what Mustafa has been working with you guys on in terms of creating a framework where heat transfer is the objective, but now you're not testing it, right? So if I look at a lot of your experiments, it's quite clear, you know, these are generic volumes, and you are starting to play with strategies of looking at how heat dissipates and these kinds of issues. But now that would mean something very different if it was a flat material, if it was a thick material, if it was a material which really retains heat, or one that clearly dissipates very clearly. So I think, like, you guys have been working in a kind of blueprint for a simulation framework. Now we need to speak a little bit, I think, from my perspective, more about, okay, what is this kind of architecture beyond heat transfer, which is the which is like the phase change stimulus or any of these other things, what's material in your case? What are we harvesting? How do we capture energy? How do we dissipate it? You know, some of the models that we've talked about, some of them can be existing in nature. Other things I think can be totally invented. But I think what's important is to start to look at some of the other stuff that you guys have done and look for opportunities to not only create space, but to think about heat and other aspects as resources. Heat is one resource. Illumination for me is also very, very important, because as much as heat is a very primal thing, light is something that is so inherently part of your work. But that's not really given the same legibility computationally, right? And I think that that's something that is very important to do. I mean, there are certain other things about like the sanitation and disinfection and all of these other things. These things could be important, but I think they're not, because we're talking about, you know, human life and what does that really mean to sustain an environment and sanitary issues. But I really like some of these things, like being able to create kind of focused deployment, amplifying heat, because in some ways they start to speak to a way of how we can harness, but then also deploy that, right? It's not a passive system. In this case, it could be very active. So for example, the difference between the water team is showing this kind of water harvesting thing where, you know, airflow is coming and it's capturing the water and it creates a pool of water. You know, in this case, it's more like that solar sintering project where, for example, I could design a machine to focus heat, make something like a high concentration light source and actually, you know, melt sand and create glass, for example. Like, it could be something that can be almost like the previous team in air, where we really are looking at it as an infrastructure for production or an infrastructure for generation of electricity or something else. So you guys have those aspects, I think, legible. I think what's interesting to me is the idea of cooking and all of these other things can be really at the heart of maybe some of the space making thought process. The same way that we talked about the fireplace, organizing the home, that was also around those concepts, right? Heat is where everybody would want to be. That's where the living room is for Frank Lloyd Wright. You know what I mean? It can go very traditional or it can go amazingly radical. I think we are probably a studio that would lean towards maybe more kind of experimental ideas of what material is in your case. So I think when you have heat as a source, you can do a lot of things to different materials. You can form it, you can bend it, you can bind it. That's one aspect. You know, when it comes to fire, we can't basically live in fire, so we have to control it. So if you think about your concept of creating things, also your concept of dissipation, I think is just as important as generation, like to dissipate. I think that that's very interesting to me. I also think that your project from an environmental perspective would mean something very different, right? So for example, if this is in the desert, like that solar sintering project, it's really about creating environments to combat the heat. You may use heat as a generator, but your architecture would be really about dissipation of heat to make a sustained environment. So it's these kinds of questions. I think the forest fires and all of these other things, what's important about them is, you know, you guys walk a very thin line between destructive forces and generative forces, very realistically, right? So in forests, maintaining a healthy forest, the fire is actually really important, but if the fire goes out of control, there's no forest anymore, right? So it's always that kind of tight roping with danger. But I mean, from your guys' perspective, what are your thoughts on some of this stuff? I mean, I think Mustafa and Apo can talk a bit about what their thoughts are, and maybe that's useful before. But I think these are the kinds of questions that we were debating about. And what I like about it is like it's a little bit of a debate of where you put your emphasis. I think we all can agree that heat transfer is a translation aspect that I think will serve you well in terms of heat, but in terms of computation, to be able to understand how to deal with generating heat or deploying heat. But I don't know, a lot of the phototactical and heliotropism work, I think gives us a lot of opportunity to think of a distributed system, field-based kind of infrastructure and architecture. And I quite like the fact of the cooking and the ritual and the ideas around light and heat from a social perspective, because I think that that's something that's potentially unique in your work.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see what you guys have been working on, Panayota, next week or as soon as possible, possibly, in terms of, you know, this idea of materiality. But in general, I think computationally, you know, we just have to start using this kind of computational diagram that you've generated to start thinking very actively about, I think in your case right now, the inputs and outputs of the system, right? So versus like, for example, the water team where I talked very clearly about patterning, I think we have to start talking about the inputs to the system and what it represents. And then in a very parallel fashion, start to talk about the outputs and what their potentials are. I think there's some questions to be answered about input, because that's where I think we can clarify a lot of things about, is this thing a simulation of heat? Which in my opinion, it is absolutely not. But I think we should really look at that early on and engage in a robust conversation with Apo and Theo at the beginning of the term about, you know, what are the inputs to this system, right? I think Theo had a really good point about things like potentially exploring people as inputs to a heat-based system or a heat-based diagram as a very clear reference point, because people are heat sources to an extent. So, you know, it introduces an ability to consider a dynamic input source to the system, which is its own agent, being a human being. However, we still have the responsibility to talk about what is this diagram? What does heterogeneity mean in this diagram? Is it a material heterogeneity, or is it a diagrammatic and spatial one? You know, what is the output of these stored information values? Like this slide is perfect. You know, what is the output of these dark orange versus red versus white? Is it about how heat moves through a system, you know, or is it about representing some other action based on the information stored in the system? Especially if we start to consider it as a volumetric piece that an agent like a human can move through. So to me, like a lot of the initial work with you guys will be about very quickly discussing what are the inputs to a system like this and how do they change the processing of information and the outputs of that information from a system like this, so that we can start to explore concepts of volume and then space very quickly as well. So I think different to, for example, like I said, again, the water team, where we were talking a lot about the output of their system being the legibility of the pattern as the first plan of attack for them. I think for you guys, the first plan of attack will be heavily about what are the inputs and what do they represent, right? So I think we'll have to take a varied approach so we can show a range of experiments to have a good conversation. So we don't have to just explore one thing. I think we can explore a variety where the diagram is taken quite literally as a heat simulation, or it can be taken more as a spatial simulation, or it can be taken as an information diagram. And in each of those, the role of the input will be slightly different. I think you guys have the capability, from what I've seen from you in the last term, to parallelize your work in a good way to produce different results. And I think a lot of that kind of philo, the kind of basic geometric orientation to the heat is a really good first step to start manifesting this outside of just a color diagram as well. which will also allow for much clearer critique of the diagrams, if that makes sense, right? So people are not just looking at voxel-based color systems, right? But for me, I think that's really what we have to tackle head-on first thing in the term, is the inputs of the system in a variety of option ways, so we can have a meaningful conversation about what could happen next from that. I think that could be quite exciting, because I think you guys have quite a robust framework, so I have no problem pushing you guys to test it out in a variety of ways as fast as possible, if that makes sense.
I mean, let's put it this way. Most of us quite excited about your computational framework, and I think that that's always good when that is, you know, moving in a trajectory that is seeing possibilities. I think the one thing that we've always debated about is what you mean by input. Not Mustafa, but you guys. So input values, in some sense, should be conditioned, and to closely kind of align that either with a position of material versus position of environment. The more direct that becomes, I think the more clear you will actually understand the codification difference. And I think that then that gives you the opportunity to experiment in different ways and see what those outcomes actually may mean for you. But I think the input-output aspect is not an abstract thing. This is where maybe the discussion is something for you guys to kind of consider. But I think, like, because this is guided by heat transfer and it hasn't been exploited to actually show dissipation or attraction of heat, but we know that the project is dealing with energy and resourcing, I think it's important to try to play that out in as explicit of a manner as possible and see what that gives you. It may not be enough by any means to generate space or to generate other things. So there may be other interpretations of things. But I think it's important that you guys kind of struggle with that discussion, because I think that that's where the project could potentially generate something very novel. You know, the scenarios of what materials you're going to use in the future, I mean, it's not so important, but your attitude of how you're harnessing the environment will always be very important. That's what's foundational about the studio. And that's what sets up the scenarios, so forth. Apo, you have any thoughts?
Well, my main thinking, I think we discussed that, is effectively looking at this diagram and getting this kind of 5 elements of what heat and fire is, and trying to put the materiality next to it, try to give it some physical presence instead of being an abstract, let's say, computational model necessarily. Try to bring it to the physical world and see what is actually that we're working with. And I think this will help you quite a lot in the long run, also with your simulation, because it's going to give you data about things. So, and all those little, this kind of 5 topics, they have some kind of computational and general, they have a logic, right? So when we talk about this slide here, where as a phenomenon, what you're exploring is heat transfer, right? But the location of these blue and yellows is actually, it has a meaning, it has a logic. So what is the logic of that in relation to one of those aspects, for instance? Like, how do you link the position strategy of your matter, of your system, or of your simulation relating to those 5 elements here? Because this is kind of the prerequisite to build a system around heat and fire.
I mean, if you go back to the previous slide that you had about
That one.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's probably the most explicit to me is the fact that you're talking about a multi-material process. So it seems, and I don't want to kind of push it in that direction yet, but it's up to you guys. But it seems to me like even by the fact that you're introducing a voxel-based kind of methodology and you're speaking to different materials, that the process would be about high-resolution printing and making kind of advanced composites, in some sense, that are trying to really perform in a controlled way in terms of how you mitigate heat or how you do with other stuff, whatever that actually is in terms of harnessing a kind of infrastructure. So, I mean, it could be something that's very deposition oriented, meaning like, you can deal with high resolution printing in different ways. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a 3D printing machine. It's just to think about your architecture as a machine, that it's somehow dealing with these multi-material processes in a way that informs the way that you think about the translation of your architecture. And if you're interested in some of that stuff, an ex-DRL student who's written a lot about this in a PhD, Kostas Grigoriadis, did a PhD on multimateriality, and a lot of that was actually looking at glass and soft metals and looking at thermal expansions and different ways of kind of codifying gradated kind of materials. And so I think it may be something that you can look into. I don't know if you guys would agree on the multi-material aspect of what these guys are potentially implicating.
Yeah. It's definitely an opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, even if I just take this as face value, it seems to me like that would be the contemporary interpretation of using this kind of strategy.
Yeah.
So I would say that, as a byproduct, I would just say that you are exploring multi-materiality, because I think it would be much more helpful to basically say to me that red has a coefficient of expansion and contraction of this. So even if you're passing heat through something, the fact that you have 3 codified materials with different coefficients means that their behavior would be different. And then I could be able to examine what that difference really means. Maybe that means curvature, maybe that means porosity, maybe that means something totally different. But it would be a way to really understand that beyond the kind of codification of something, because then the voxelization strategy potentially could start translating by just like shrinking or expanding those voxels. And a research that we've always, I think, really admired here is a lot of the soft voxel strategies that Todd Lipson was doing, which would introduce kind of behaviors of, emergent behaviors based on those kind of things. So I would say potentially to look into that as well. Does that make sense to you guys, Apo, Mustafa?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any questions from you guys? Panayota, anybody else?
I think what we were mostly concerned about is how to find the right balance and the right connection between the research part and the computational framework, because I feel like we have so many different examples and so many different directions that we could potentially look at in the research part. And then we mainly focused on the heat transfer on the computational part.
Yeah,
so we felt like we didn't know if we should try to look at something else computationally also, or how to connect all these different things that we have in the research with the computational.
I think the things that I would suggest that, illumination is not part of your model right now in any way. And I don't think it has to be directly engaged in this computational framework, though I'm sure most of us could translate what you guys have been doing into an illumination strategy too. I think the issue is that, yes, your computational work has been very linear, and I think that's why most of us sees this beyond heat transfer. But at the same time, I think the slide in which you show ritual, illumination, all of these other things, somehow, if I take that seriously, it somehow prioritizes some of the work that you've done more explicitly than others. So, for example, I would be looking at techniques that I could use. So, for example, the infrared strategies of extracting meaningful data, for example, of body heat, is something that's operational, right? So, for example, if we say that humans are also heat sources, and in very, very specific cases, I mean, we've done projects in extreme environments, like in the polar ice caps and stuff like that. I mean, there's not a lot of heat energy, but heat energy needs to be maintained, particularly in humans, to keep them alive, right? So that's something that's very important to monitor. That's something that would be a real-time information that would be important. So even in terms of thinking about prototyping, some of these technologies, particularly image technologies around these things, is kind of interesting because we may not know how to implement it, but we know it's important, right? Like if your architecture is really about a survival architecture for humans, the only way that it could really know that is if it can monitor the people that are there. And that's where abstraction maybe becomes interesting. You can create an environment where humans are a heat source. Even if they're the only heat source and they're responding to things, you're able to start to understand the logic of the crowd or how things could function within an environment. I think there are other things like the forest work and stuff like that, that's, you know, in terms of literally burning and charring, that stuff to me personally is really secondary right now because it's interesting to know that, but I don't see it's operationally yet. The focusing of heat, I think, is very important from my perspective because heat, in the same way that we were looking at wind to generate energy, the sun can, you know, with your phototactic strategies and so forth, harness energy in this way. So I imagine a strand of research which is really looking at field studies that are trying to maximize surface area, you know, designs of things that are not just like generic solar cells, but ways of unfolding surfaces to maybe capture more surface area exposure. Organizational logics that would deploy that in a way that's meaningful. But this high energy concentration is where I think also then, you know, if we're really talking about cooking, you know, there are cooks that are basically just using these magnifying glasses to basically, you know, barbecue in the middle of nowhere and stuff like that. There are different ways of thinking about those things. I think it's important to see how you would work on them. Some may be more computational. Maybe some of them are some experiments. Like I'm not saying to start a forest fire or to pull magnets out, magnifying glasses and to burn ants or anything. You know, these things are more like, well, how do you deal with reorientation of a plane? And that's being dynamically reconfigured either by the environment in a one-to-one place or in a response to the information from the environment, which is much more where we're headed. So I think I wouldn't worry too much about that, but this material needs to be organized in a way that really explains that, right? Like the fireplace, if you guys use a generic image of the fireplace, it looks like you just Googled this and you did a 5-minute Google video. But if you say in the history of architecture, and that's why I used the Frank Lloyd Wright example, space being organized around the heat source, I think has very important cultural and social construction. So from like the caveman to Frank Lloyd Wright, there is a strong presence of that. And even in terms of what's your space is going to bias, I think that's important. So I think like it's not 100% a linear thing. So we need to be able to keep these processes moving in parallel. I do think it has to be more than heat transfer. So I agree. That connection is not 100% there because it's not just about heat transfer. So these other elements need to somehow emerge in the ways that you're working on it. And that doesn't always have to be like in Unity and stuff like that, right? We can be exploring, I think, a lot of different tools on this, from tangible media to, in your case, I would say it would be more tangible media too, to be honest. I don't see why we couldn't start working on a prototype with Apple to really deal with illumination as a strategy beyond just like some blinky LED lights or stuff like that. Okay. Any other questions? anyway, I think, we'll send you a couple of documents that you guys can have a look at. If there are any particular projects that come to mind, we'll try to share those things to all the teams, just to have some references. You shouldn't wait for those things, though. You should just organize them in a B5 template, and yeah, you can send it across to us. We can comment on it and send it back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Cool. Next.
Next is Earth.
Paul, can we share our screen? Because we add something new about three-dimensional fluid. Yeah.
Well, you can, but we're not doing new stuff. We're doing the old stuff now.
We have not. Well, yeah, I think you have it.
Is it your connection really bad, or is mine? I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, Apple. Please let me share my screen.
Okay, give me a second.
Yeah, we have done some new 3D simulation. Maybe we can share it.
Go for it.
Guys, you really want us to show us new stuff?
Yeah, it's like
help you organize your book.
Actually, we are gonna start to prepare for the booklet. We just.
You mean the booklet that we asked?
Yeah, this day we are struggling with the three-dimensional code. So, yeah, maybe we'll spend some time on the booklet.
Okay, let's do this since we've given every team a half hour. You have 10 minutes to tell us what you want to tell us.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. We know that we lost many initial research before, so we added to the booklet, and it's about our booklet's framework. So it's all about introduction, background, research, and we just need to connect Earth with research, with growth together to show its potential.